Hi, I'm Katie Crane, and this is the Pilates Lounge. Hi guys, my name's Katie Crane. I'm the Pilates professional. Welcome to another episode of the Pilates Lounge podcast. I'm so thrilled that you have decided to join me on this episode. Now, before I get started, I would like to share some podcast love with you. You know what? When somebody reaches out and lets me know what it is that they're getting out of these shows, then it really does drive me to keep going. The thing with podcasting is I'm sitting here in front of my computer speaking to thin air. I have no idea whether or not you're listening. And I have no idea whether or not what I'm conversing about is really hitting the mark. The idea with this podcast is that I want to share my years of experience in movement, and I want to create a community of movement professionals or Pilates professionals and movement lovers so that we can make a difference in the world. So when people reach out to me and let me know that I have hit the mark or I have helped their Pilates teaching, it really does let me know that this is worth it. So thank you, Lisa, for reaching out. Lisa said, "Hi, Katie. I just wanted to say that I've been loving your podcasts on the fascial lines. You explain everything so clearly and simply. It's really helped my understanding of them and how I can apply everything to my clients. Thank you so much." So when Lisa reached out to me, and she just did so on my Instagram page, then I could email her back or I could message her back, say thank you, but also ask her what else is it that she wants to learn about, because I've got so much information in here that sometimes I don't know when to be sharing stuff, or, how far do I progress, or how far back should I be taking things to be sharing with you guys. So please let me know what it is that you want. And then after the conversation that I had with Lisa, she told me other things that she wants to learn about. So this is awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time. It really does mean the world. Now, because Lisa enjoyed my fascial lines shows so much, and those were episodes 15 and 16. If you have not listened to those episodes yet, today's episode marries really well with those fascial episodes. So you could go back and listen to them after this, that's fine, but definitely it's worth you taking a listen to episode 15 and 16. Today's episode is all about communicating effectively with cueing. Now, the thing with cueing and communicating is we can only cue effectively if we understand how the brain and the body work. So I'm going to take a bit of a deep dive today into this topic, because cueing does not start with language. It's very important that we understand this. When we actually have a good understanding of the concept of the fascial lines, so the fascial lines are when slings of muscles or when groups of muscles are working coherently together to create movement, then our cueing changes. And when we do understand fascial lines and we change our cueing, we see the magic of Pilates happen in our classes. Now, if you are not at the stage of understanding fascial lines in your Pilates classes, in your Pilates teaching, or even in your own practice, it's absolutely fine. I did not understand it either. I wish that I understood it sooner than what I did, but I think actually when I was learning my Pilates, then there wasn't a lot of talk about fascia anyway. But I definitely know that once this was introduced to me, the way that I cue completely shifted, and the way that I was seeing my clients move was with so much more ease and freedom And so they were moving more coherently. So to me, coherent movement means the body moving well holistically. So the body moving as a whole very well. In the good old days, before I understood all of this about the brain and the body and the fascial lines, I used to cue things like, I can't even think of it now, but you would cue like just the abdominals on their own. So I might say, draw the belly button to the spine is probably a classic Pilates cue that I do not use anymore, or I use it very, very sparingly. But before I understood all of this, that cue was really, really common in my teaching. Now I understand why it wasn't necessarily making a positive difference in my clients' Pilates experience. So we're going to go through that. Another cue that I probably used to use would be, oh gosh, I couldn't even think of one now. Maybe like, so pull the belly button to the spine, where you're just talking about like the torso. So tilting the pubic bone towards the belly button to get somebody to go into a posterior tilt. While I do still use that cue, I use a whole host of other cues with that to make sure that the entire body is working appropriately to perform that movement, because even a pelvic tilt is not just a pelvic tilt when we're looking at the body as a whole. And the whole point of Pilates is we don't isolate muscles. We are moving the entire system dynamically and intrinsically together, or systemically together, coherently as an orchestra. We do not isolate muscles in Pilates. The way that I see it is, say this is what I say to my clients, because sometimes they want to know, for example, what muscle is working right now. Sometimes I might talk about it a little bit. I don't believe that it's necessarily going to help somebody improve the way that they move by knowing exactly what muscle is working. But this is how I explain it to my clients. And this is why I don't necessarily use individual muscles that I'm telling them about. Say if you want to take a coffee cup out of the cupboard, I'm going to reach up to the cupboard, I'm going to grab my coffee cup, and I'm going to pull it back down. There is no moment in that activity where I'm thinking to myself, okay, bicep, okay, tricep, let's do this. Bicep, tricep, go, let's reach, go. Going to grab that coffee. Bicep, tricep, switch back up. I'm going to bring that coffee cup down. I'm not thinking that at all. What I'm thinking, if I'm thinking anything at all, which I'm actually hardly not, except maybe, geez, I wish my husband didn't put the coffee cup so far in the back because he's heaps taller than me and I can't reach it. If anything, if I'm having to try and reach something, I'm thinking if I could just get a little bit taller, if I could just reach a little bit further, then I could grab that coffee cup. That's what's going on in my head. So why in my teaching would I ever be saying, and now switch on your bicep and your tricep to do whatever exercise? It's not how our brain understands the body. And it certainly is not how the body communicates to the brain. I want you to put that in back of mind while I get into the beginning of today's episode. All right. So ultimately, in today's episode, to understand communicating effectively through cueing, we are actually going to explore a truly fascinating aspect of our brain's architecture. I can never say this word, so bear with me. But what I'm talking about is the homunculus. Homunculus. I think that's how you say it. I'm going to spell it. Homunculus. Have you ever heard of that word? Maybe, maybe not. Now, we teach this to our students from the get-go. So when our students are learning to become reformer instructors, we talk about the brain's architecture and we show our students this tiny distorted image. Now, you've possibly seen this image. It's like a tiny distorted figure stretched out within the folds of your brain. And so this little figure has massively huge hands, these big luba lips, a really long, grotesquely distorted face with big eyes, big ears, and a big nose, and very big genitals and massive feet. But his body is super small. His arms are kind of long but very gangly, and his legs are short and stumpy. Have you seen that image somewhere before? Now, no, this is not a creature from a fantasy novel. This is a scientific way for us to visualize how our brain processes sensory and motor information. Now, maybe you've heard of those terms, sensory and motor information. So our motor homunculus maps out the areas of the brain that are dedicated to movement for different parts of the body, located in the brain. So it's in here that our brain handles signals for movement. We receive cues from our frontal lobes. So, compared to switching gears to sensation, our sensory homunculus sprawls the post-central part of the brain and basically the primary somatosensory cortex. And this is responsible for processing tactile information from the body. So tactile, sometimes we cue with tactile cueing, so touching of the body. So it interprets signals from the thalamus, which is located in the brain, just above the brainstem, between the cerebral cortex and the midbrain. And this in turn gathers inputs from our entire body through the brainstem and the spinal cord. So we have the motor sensory. So motor is us moving. And then we have the sensory part of the body. So we have information coming into the body from our external or from our environment. That information goes up through the spinal cord to the brain. The brain decides what needs to happen, sends the message back down through the spinal cord into the nerves, into the peripherals for the body to move. Now, this happens very, very quickly, but we have these two parts of the spinal cord and the nervous system and the brain working together to respond to our environment. Now, when we understand this as movement professionals, it's very, very important to understand this so that then we can choose our cues appropriately. So when we look at the homunculus, right? So remember I said big eyes, big nose, massive big lips, ears, long distorted face, massive big hands, big genitals, and big feet. This is actually where we receive a lot of information. What happens is we have a lot of nerve endings in these parts of our body. So we have a lot of nerve endings through nose, mouth, or lips. Like, think of what happens when you kiss someone. Like, close your eyes right now and imagine kissing someone. Maybe it's somebody you got the hots for. Maybe it's the first romantic kiss you ever had with somebody. Maybe it's your husband, your wife, whatever. But can you take yourself into that moment and think of when you kiss somebody, it sends these like almost sparkles through your whole body. It sends shivers through your whole body. There's a heck of a lot of sensation in our lips. There's also a lot of sensation in our nose. If you were to flick your nose, punch your nose, goodness me, it hurts. It's one of the most painful things you can do is to hit your nose. But we also have our olfactory. So our senses in our nose, we're taking in scents or smells as well. Our ears, we're always listening with our ears, but our ears are also very, very sensitive. If you've got a brother or sister and they flicked your ears, especially when they're cold, it really hurts to flick your ears. Your ears have a lot of nerve endings. Our eyes, of course, are part of our five senses. We're always looking around. We're always taking in information. So we have a lot of information coming into the brain through the eyes. Our hands and our feet is really what we're touching the earth with all day long. And our hands and feet, because of the way that we move, are always sending information through the body into the spinal cord, up to the brain for the brain to decide what is appropriate for us to do. So, for example, if we put our hand on a hot stove plate, then very quickly that sensory information is going to be received by the brain and will take the hand off the hot plate. Or say if you're walking along rocks or something and they're a little bit slippery, then very quickly that information needs to go to the brain for you to either change the way that you're walking or even choose a different pathway. So our hands and feet are big on the homunculus because we're relying on the information through those senses. Of course, I probably don't even need to talk about it, but the genitals also are sensory organs. They're giving us a lot of information about the experience that we're having and feeding that information to the brain. Now, I dare say that's probably so that as a species, we continue to survive. But these parts of the body are always continuing to talk to the brain so that we are receiving all of the information that we need to. But the thing is, this incredible mapping really represents more than just a quirky aspect of neuroscience. It underscores the fundamental truth about human experience. Our perception of the world and our actions within it are deeply influenced by how our brain prioritizes information. And I've said it before that our brain is like a catalog. Our brain is always taking in information specifically through those areas of the body that have a lot of sensory nerves in them and then cataloging that information. So in essence, the homunculus isn't just a figure in our brains. It's a profound illustration of our lived experiences, how we communicate, and ultimately how we understand the world around us. Now, the whole homunculus, I'm just going to continue to say it very, very poorly, so please forgive me on that. But, this whole idea, it was actually brought about by a guy called Walter Penfield and his co-investigators, Edwin Baldry and Theodore Rasmussen. Now, their contributions to neuroscience are absolutely monumental. Now, unlike their predecessors who also ventured into mapping the human brain's functions, Penfield and his teams really made distinct strides. And we use these homunculi, the understanding of how the brain is mapping the body in everything that we do. And if we understand this as movement professionals, then I tell you what, the way that you cue really does change. So initially, these maps were really brought about for these neuroscientists. It was like a thought experiment that they had, and then they started to do tests on people who were undergoing surgery for epilepsy control, so they were able to start to map out the brain. And actually, furthering these tests, like the legacy of their work is where MRIs came from. So, the importance of understanding the brain really has furthered our ability to work with the body in a very distinct and intrinsic and life-changing ways, because we know that MRIs really have changed a lot of people's lives. But from our perspective as movement educators, always understanding that our clients are taking in information through their hands, their feet, and ultimately their face. In everything that they do, we can start to create cues and form language in studio that is going to help them move better. So if we take that homunculus, that figure, big hands, big feet, massive facial features, ultimately, and we integrate that with our understanding of the fascial lines. So remember, the fascial lines are like whole slings of the body working together. So, for example, let's review the back fascial line. Actually starts at the very base of the feet. So we're looking at the arches of the feet, and then it comes all the way back up through the Achilles, in through the back of the legs, hamstrings, ischial tuberosities, in through those deep back extensors and right up through the skull. If we're thinking of that and thinking of, well, what parts of the homunculus is that touching on? Ultimately, we could be thinking the head and the feet. When we start to cue from the base of the feet all the way to the head, then everything in between kind of stacks up the way that it's designed to, compared to if we're just talking to our clients. For example, come back to that cue of drawing the belly button to the spine. What is the whole point of drawing the belly button to the spine when the body is not designed to work independent muscles? It is designed to work in whole sling. So if we wanted to use a cue of drawing the belly button to the spine, we actually need to be thinking what the feet are doing, because from belly button to the spine, I would be looking down through the inner thighs all the way down through the inside of arches of the feet, but also from through the pelvis up through the diaphragm and right in through to the very top of the roof of the mouth. This is actually where we should be cueing from, I believe, when we're talking to the body in a holistic structure and in a holistic nature. And that is the difference of Pilates to many other movement practices, is that we are working with the mind, body, and soul as a whole. So we always should be cueing the body as a whole. So what is happening from the roof of the mouth? Now, neurologically, the roof of the mouth is connected to the pelvic floor and to the arches of the feet. Now, this is also something that we teach our students from the get-go, that that deep core structure does not just consist of pelvic floor, transverse abdominals, or I'm not quite sure what you're trying to do when you're drawing belly button to the spine. Anyway, I do understand, of course I do. You're trying to create this deep C curve, but the deep C curve comes from the entire back line and the entire deep front line or the midline working together. All right, I went off a little bit, I know, went off on a little bit of a tangent. All right, so with that in mind, what we want to be doing is taking into account this distorted little figurine. This is where people are feeling things from their outside world. So, for example, if I'm teaching footwork, I'm very specific about where I want the feet on the foot bar, where I want the heels placed, what part of the heels are placed. But then I'm talking at the other end, what I want you to be feeling through the crown of the head. So is the crown of the head opening wide into the back of the carriage, or do you want them to feel like the crown of the head is pulling long throughout the end of the reformer? Whatever it is that you're deciding, it's not just footwork, right? It's a whole body exercise. Similarly, then I'm thinking about, because I know about the homunculus, so I place their feet on there, but then even in their footwork, what is happening through the hands? What is the impression of the hands? Are the hands just resting on the belly, or are they pressing down into the carriage? I know that I prefer hands pressing down into the carriage if you're doing your footwork. That assists with the whole back line, but also I know that there's a lot of sensory information coming in through the hands. Then I'm looking at people's face. Are their eyes open? Are their eyes closed? Now, this could be a different conversation, actually. And at some stage, I will talk to you about the 4 different personalities of Pilates, which might be a new thing for you. That's okay. But a creative personality is often going to have their eyes closed, and that's okay. Or a thinker might sometimes have their eyes closed, whereas a mover or a detective is probably going to have their eyes open. But if I'm just, for example, footwork, if I'm doing footwork, I do want to get a sense of what's happening in the face. If the person is scowling, if they're holding their breath, if their eyes are closed or open, and I want to try and allow for or cue for the person to maybe soften the face, maybe bring awareness to the jawline if they're clenching the jaw or anything like that, just because of the idea of the homunculus. This is all of our sensory parts of the body are playing a role in everything that we do. So partly I'm taking information from the body in front of me of what their response is to whatever exercise it is that I'm giving them. But in turn, from their response, I'm choosing how to cue them. I hope that makes sense to you. All right. Now, that's the homunculus, right? But also, like I said, please go back and listen to those fascial slings workshops. I do have one more fascial sling conversation to bring to you. I'm sure I do. I don't think I've done the one on the deep front line, which basically is the abdominals. I know, right? How dare I forget that one? I didn't forget it. I just had other stuff that I wanted to do and I wanted to come back to it. So I will get to that at some stage. So be sure you listen to that. But hands, feet, face, what is happening to them. So actually, let's go into this a little bit more. Let's say, for example, I'm doing a rowing series, right? So rowing, surely I'm not really using my feet in the rowing, am I? I've got my hands in the straps. Say I'm doing rowing facing the headrest. I've got my feet on the headrest with my legs extended out in front of me. But actually, yes, I do want to know what my feet are doing. Are my toes pointed? Are my feet flexed? Am I pressing down and through the heels? I am actually pressing down through the heels because I want that entire backline working. It's still a posterior sling exercise. But then with the hands, and I see this all the time when I'm doing the rowing, I like to bring the fists together in front of the chest. So I think it's called from the sternum. Oh my gosh, I'm so bad at names, but I think it's called from the sternum. Maybe it's not. Anyway, it's the one where you're facing the headrest and then you're going to roll back, right? But I do want to be cueing through the fists, or however it is that you like to hold the hands. I'm putting energy through the fists and I'm keeping the same distance between the hands and the chest all the time. Right. So I'm cueing where the hands need to be. People know where their hands are much more than where they know where their torso is. So this is my whole point of not necessarily cueing belly button to spine. So when you start to roll down in this rowing exercise, I am not saying draw the belly button to the spine as you roll back, because the brain doesn't really know where the belly button is to the spine in relation to the rest of the body. So while you may then succeed at getting the person to draw their belly button to the spine, not a lot else is happening in the body. And they're actually missing the point of getting that whole back line working with the front line, which is the point of this exercise. Instead, first, I'm cueing. So say you're sitting up straight with your fists together. You've got that semicircle shape of your arms, but I'm cueing through the fists and I'm cueing through the feet. As you start to roll back, I want you to feel that you're pushing the heels down in towards the headrest and away from you, and that you maintain the same distance between the hands and the chest the entire time as you roll on down. While you roll back, the back of the head is getting pulled up and back away from you, almost like you're sliding the back of the head up a brick wall as you come back, and your eyes are gazing down towards your toes. The rest of the body then will follow. When it comes to tactile cueing, and tactile cueing plays a huge role in the work that we do, if it's appropriate for the person, then if anything, I'm not coming past and rearranging the torso, even though they may not be getting the flexion or the C curve in the torso that I want them to get. I'm rearranging their head placement. I know it's crazy, right? So because of the understanding of how the brain works with these sensory organs, if I can get the head rearranged well, the hands rearranged well, and the feet correct first, then I start to get into maybe talking about, a little bit more through the pubic bone or a little bit more through the sacrum. But first I'm cueing the very external parts, or what's the opposite of distal? Yeah, the most distal part. So proximal is close to, distal is far away. So I'm cueing the most distal parts, the most far away parts of that midline, getting that correct first. Then the movement starts to not only look better, but my client definitely is able to feel the entire line of the body working the way that it's designed to, because I have accessed the brain's understanding of the sensory, motor, cortex, or this, that whole system of sensory information going into the body, motor information going out to the body. Do you understand that? I think I've made that pretty clear, right? So sensory is us taking information from our external world. That information goes through the spinal cord into the brain, and then the motor, the brain then goes, oh, okay, we're going to do this, right? So I'm working with that system by cueing the face, the feet, and the hands. You could cue genitals as well, of course, but I don't. But sometimes I do come back and cue the pelvis, right? Because the pubic bone, the sacrum, that is very close to the genital. So people do tend to understand that. But I'm not saying belly button to spine. Never. I really never say it. It's like the very, very last cue that I'd ever choose for somebody to get into a deep C curve. I know that's going to blow some of your minds, because I go to a lot of Pilates classes when I travel, and I hear that cue pretty much every single class I go to. I'm not sure where the cue came from, but I think that it's rubbish. Just putting it out there. All right, moving on. So I've already briefly touched on tactile cueing, but we know that tactile cueing is so, so powerful for people. When we cue tactile, so tactile is hands-on, it's not always appropriate for us to put hands on somebody. And if you're teaching a big group class, it can be really difficult to know when or when it's not appropriate to put hands on. So I'm going to leave that to you to move carefully into that experience or into that situation. Personally, I always ask somebody if they're okay if I help them with my hands. That's how I say it. Can I help you find that movement with my hands? And then if they're cool with it, I'll get my hands on them. But I'm also very, very careful where I touch somebody. I will not touch somebody around the pelvis, and I will not touch somebody around the boobs. Just putting it out there. I do see people pushing their fingers into people's sits bones and getting way too close for my comfort. I think you need to decide that as an instructor, but please don't come and touch my nether regions. If you're teaching me, find a better way to teach me. All right, but definitely just pop that out, put that out there with the people that you are teaching. Is it okay to put your hands on them? And then if it is okay to put your hands on them, I am also putting my hands on the person through the head. So if I want them to grow taller, I've got my fingertips at the very crown of their head, and I'm asking them to press their head into my hand. Maybe I've got my hand cupping the base of their skull to help them either create something like a better C curve or, better length through the spine. I'm using their hands against my hands, knowing that they're going to get a lot of information into their body through their hands, or I'm using the machine. Anytime somebody's got their hands on the foot bar, in the straps, on the shoulder rest, anywhere, if their hands are touching something, then their brain is getting a heck of a lot of feedback right there. All it takes is then for you to choose appropriate cues from the hands, not necessarily the shoulders. So from the hands first, what's happening in their hands? Where is the energy going? Where are they pulling? Where are they pushing? And same in the feet. If I'm getting my hands on someone, I've got my hands on people's feet. And you know what? Hands, feet, and head are much more comfortable areas for people to have your hands on them than anywhere else in the body. So it's respectful towards somebody else. I don't own somebody else's body. So it just blows my mind when I see an instructor get their fingers into somebody's sits bones. I'm like, hello, compared to hands, feet, and head. I'm just putting it out there. But also knowing that this is where there's a lot of sensory information. So I'm actually a better instructor if I am touching those parts of the body, because I'm giving much more holistic information, much more systemic information to the movement. But like I said, I'm always using the equipment. If you're doing something like splits, so you're standing on the carriage, I'm cueing through the feet. So if you're standing on the carriage and you're pushing the carriage out doing your splits or your skater, first I want to let my students know where their feet are placed and where their energy is going through the feet. Is it through the big toe, the little toe, up through the arches? Where should they be putting all of their load? And then that's where they're pressing into. They're not pressing out from their glutes, right? So say if you're doing the splits, but you're heavy loading it because you want it to be a glute exercise, you do not get the glutes to work by cueing through the glutes. You get the glutes to work by cueing appropriately through the feet. You need to play around with it yourself if you haven't felt this before. Oh, definitely. Actually, in July, while you guys are here, in July, I have a series of 4 workshops coming out. One of them is exactly this, communicating with effective cueing. So I do want you to jump on board and do this workshop with me. So if you haven't already signed up to the Pilates Muse or to our newsletter, then definitely check out the show notes and sign up today, because this will improve your teaching. And if you are a movement lover and you're not an instructor, please join me on this workshop. Once you feel how the body works from the hands, feet, and head, it's going to absolutely blow your mind what you can get out of your own Pilates work and what your clients can get out of it. So this is coming in July, just a reminder. But let's go back to the exercise. So say if I'm cueing splits and I want a little bit of excessive load, so I really want them to be feeling it through the glutes, I'm not telling them to squeeze the bottom to push the carriage out, because that's not actually what's doing any more than, remember, getting my coffee cup out of the cupboard. I'm not like biceps, triceps, let's go to get my coffee cup. So why would I be saying glutes, let's go to push the carriage out? No, my feet are pushing the carriage out, but I'm cueing whereabouts exactly in the feet you're pushing to get that activation. It's only if they're not getting that, then I might come and say, listen, I actually want you to be feeling it in this part of the body. This is a glute exercise. Sometimes them knowing that and then going back to the feet, oh, okay, I feel it now, right? But it's not my first cue, definitely not. Get the feet right, come to the glutes, go back to the feet. And of course, where is the head? If somebody is looking down at their feet while they're doing the skater, they're not doing skater. If somebody is like, leaning their head back and their head is back further than the hips while they're doing the skater or the splits, it's not this right exercise. So the head placement is part of that entire system working together. Tactile cueing is amazing. It works so well. Another way to tactile cue, of course, is to use like props, So if you want to use a magic circle between the hands, the chi balls are so good at giving us feedback when we are taking into consideration the fascial slings and the homunculus. So when we add a prop onto a class, get this, it's not just to add a prop onto a class. We're not adding props on because, it's any more fun. A prop is a purpose. Everything that we are doing in Pilates has a reason behind it. And don't ever believe that the reason is your core. Like so many people think that Pilates is about increasing their core strength or improving their core strength or getting stronger in their core. No, it's not. Pilates is about improving our proprioception, so our understanding of where our body is in space, of getting the entire body working as this beautiful orchestra, like the most beautiful sound in the world, that you've ever seen an orchestra working together. It absolutely blows you away. This is the point of Pilates. So don't just bring a prop in there just because you're bored as an instructor or because you want to, in inverted commas, work the core. It's not what it's about. Bring a prop into your class because you want to bring the hands into the feet, or you want to improve the understanding of the head placement, in an exercise, whatever it is. Choose your props appropriately. All right, visual cues. Now, where was I? I've got some stuff written down here because I think that it's really important. When it comes to visual cues, we know that visual cues work really well. So, visual cues, they really significantly enhance the physical performance and coordination. But the thing is that in studio, when we're leveraging visual cues, it becomes super powerful. And we can draw directly from the principles outlined in sensory and motor system studies to access this type of thinking. So, for instance, say if you're guiding somebody to rotate in one direction, then you could say, rather than turn your head to the right, a lot of people don't know where the right and left is, believe it or not. In our studio, we have purposely put mirrors at one side of the room and then a jungle wallpaper at the other side of the room. And when we cue, say if we want somebody to be rotating, they're either rotating towards the mirror or they're rotating towards the jungle wallpaper. Now, you might have a window, so you could say rotate towards the window, or you could say rotate towards the footbar, rotate towards the headrest. So by giving people visual cues, then they have a better understanding of where it is that you want them to go. If you say to somebody, rotate to your right or rotate to your left, a lot of people don't know their left and right, but also they don't necessarily know how far they need to go. So if you have a clock on the wall and you want somebody rotating that far, then you can let them know. If you have like a certain brick on the wall, then you can let them know. These visual cues, it simplifies things for people, but having those existing markers really helps them understand their spatial, or improves their spatial understanding. So their spatial understanding is like knowing where they are in space. And it's something that we start to lose as we get older. So it is important because quite often you'll see people won't rotate as far as what they actually can if you just say right or left, or they'll rotate way too far and it's almost like they're overdoing the movement and they're not getting the entire system to be doing the work. So while I might be giving a visual cue of where I want them to be looking or where I want them to be rotating or even where I want them to be reaching their feet. So maybe they're reaching their feet towards the jungle wallpaper. They're reaching their head as far as they can towards the mirror rather than just out of their own feet. So I could say, point your toes and reach your legs away. Well, that's not very far, is it? But if I say, point your toes, reach your legs away and see if you can reach the jungle wall, immediately I will see people extending just that little bit further beyond what they thought they were able to do. And what we want to be doing is a little bit out of the comfort zone or a little bit out of what your perception was of what your ability is, right? So when we are reaching towards something that's a little bit further out of where we are, then we're going to get a little bit more out of it. So visual cues work really well for most people. Auditory cues. Of course, auditory cues are things like our tone of voice, how quickly we might be speaking, the music that we're playing in the studio, if you play music, the sounds, the other sounds that are in the studio are super important to people's experience. The level of our voice, so the pitch of our voice. I know with new instructors quite often you can hear them that they're speaking from up here. They're speaking from their throat. They're still nervous. And so when they're cueing a class, it can sound almost like very strained. And if your voice sounds strained, then the experience of the person that you're teaching is going to be strained. It's going to be forceful. It's going to be uncomfortable. When you can learn to speak from your belly or from your diaphragm and it lowers your voice a little bit, is that an octave? I forget. But if you can get your voice a little bit lower, a little bit deeper, you can actually then expand your voice further and you'll bring a sense of calm into the class. So when you can lower your voice and speak from your diaphragm and from your belly, you will come across as more knowledgeable. When you're speaking up here out of your throat, or out of your nose. And if you're out of breath all the time, then it doesn't sound like you know what you're doing. It sounds like you're really, really anxious, and nobody's really going to believe what you're saying, because it sounds like you can't wait to get out of the room. You don't really want to be there. But when you speak from down here, you speak a little bit slower, a little bit clearer, and with that depth of knowledge. It's very, very important. So the auditorial experience of your clients will either repel them or keep them coming back. And it's definitely something that we need to practice. Now, when it comes to music, it's like if you've ever played music in the background, and at our studio, it's pretty much, oh, well, whoever wants to put the music on first, then that's what we listen to. And the music that I choose is very different to the next person, and that's okay. But I also see that it does set the scene for the day. So you've got to be very careful when you're choosing music that it should really be appropriate for the people that you're teaching. The music is not about you as the teacher. It's about the environment that you're trying to create. So choose your music wisely. All right, let's finish off with a few ideas of cueing. When we're in our Pilates classes, we like to keep things light, fun, and easy to understand. So nobody cares about anatomy except for us as instructors. So we need to know anatomy. There's no doubt about it. In our 6-month reformer training program, our students have an anatomy app, and a lot of what we teach is the slings of movement, the fascial slings of movement, the anatomy of breath, anatomy of the pelvic floor, bones, joints, ligaments, muscles, the whole lot. We need to know that as instructors, but our clients don't need to know that. So we don't need to be using anatomical terms. And in fact, I worked with a woman, and I always tell this to my students, because I used to use anatomical terms. Partly I thought that that was what I was meant to be doing, because at the time, I'd spent 12 months learning my Pilates, and most of what I was learning was anatomy. And so when I went out into the teaching world, I just assumed that I should be talking anatomically, because that's what I had been reading. That's what I'd been learning. And so I went out into the world of Pilates, and I was doing the best job that I could possibly do. And I kept teaching this lady, and all the time, every time she came in, we were working on scooter, and I kept saying to her, so you're feeling that in your hamstrings, right? And she'd say, yeah, feeling it in my hamstrings. 2 years, I tell you. I would ask her every time, you're feeling that in your hamstrings, right? Yeah, she would agree with me, feeling it in my hamstrings. And one day, 2 years later, I asked her the same question I always asked her, because she didn't seem to be getting anywhere. I didn't realize back then that I needed to change what I was doing. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. But on this one particular session, I asked her the same question, and she patted her thighs, she patted her quads, and said, yeah, feeling it in my hamstrings. Well, I didn't realize that she didn't know what her hamstrings were. But why would she? She doesn't work with anatomy. She was coming to me to understand what was going on in her body. I don't ever use anatomical terms, except if I'm working with a surgeon or somebody, or a physio, or somebody who speaks anatomical terms on a daily basis. And even then, I do never assume, because I've worked with a lot of doctors now who have no idea what their pelvic floor is. So don't ever assume that just because somebody works in an industry that you think they should know something that they do, because if it's not of a personal interest to them, then they probably don't know anything about it, right? So rather than speak anatomically, talk about the front of the leg or the back of the leg. Talk about the heel talk about your heel or your toes, but also use your tactile cues, or your visual cues. So if you talk about the front of the legs, you could pat the front of your legs. If you talk about the back of the legs, you could pat the back of your legs, or you could point to them and let them know. Don't ever assume that anybody knows anything about the body. You are the expert in that person's mind. And maybe you're not an expert. I certainly was not an expert when I first started out, and that's fine. We start where we start, and that's perfect. And then we continue to learn, and we continue to move on. We continue to evolve. But be very careful with language. And then things like we've got to decide if you're using imagery. Now, imagery can be very, very powerful. And it can work wonders for people who are not necessarily body aware. So maybe, they don't know where their shoulders are compared to their ears because they're always wearing their shoulders around their ears like a pair of earrings. Well, that doesn't look very nice, and it certainly could not be comfortable for many people. So we're trying to teach that person to drop their shoulders away from their ears, almost feel like there's space between the ears and the shoulders. But if they don't know where their shoulders are in space, then maybe we could use some images. So things like allow for your shoulders to melt down your back. Imagine your shoulders, I don't know, are ice cubes and they're melting under a hot sun. Allow for them to just soften away, melt away, start dripping to the floor, whatever you want to use. But my point is, and they were very, very poor cues, I'm sorry. Oh dear. But what I do want to say is choose cues that are appropriate to the person that you're working with. So for example, say if I'm working with somebody and I know that they love gardening, well, I'm going to use garden cues. So maybe when they're standing nice and tall, I tell them to imagine that they're, a young sapling growing up into, trying to reach the sunshine, or they're a flower trying to reach the sunshine. Or if their arms are out to a T, their arms are like the limbs of a tree growing longer, or their feet are rooted into the ground. Or their body is growing like a vine, reaching in all directions like a vine. Find out what your clients are interested in. If I'm working with swimmers, my cues are going to be very different to if I'm working with footballers. If I'm working with cyclists, my cues are going to be very different to if I'm working with a bunch of 80-year-olds that are sitting around having cups of tea all day. So choose language that is appropriate to the person that you're working with, because you could have the most amazing cues in your back pocket for your body, but if it's not appropriate to the person, then it means nothing and it really does fall flat. We work with a lot of tradies, and one of our instructors is a bloke, and he used to be a landscaper, and he comes up with the best cues that I just steal from him. I'm hopeless at cues for tradies because it's not how my mind works, but I've learnt from him using things like scaffolding or ladders or, imagine like a hose. Yeah, some of the cues that he uses are really unique to that type of imagery. So learn from the people that you're working with, but learn the language of your client. And that's ultimately what communicating effectively is all about. It's not getting our client to learn our language. It's us learning what they understand and then recreating or finding ways to speak to them in ways that they can understand and that make sense to them, that really matters to them. So I hope that this has given you a little bit of insight. If you have not seen the homunculus, in this episode or on all of our episodes, there's always a blog that goes with it. So in the blog on the website, thepilatesprofessional.com.au, there will be a picture of homunculus so that you can have a look at it and understand. But definitely go back and listen to episode 15 and 16 on the fascial lines. There's another fascial episode coming out. Go onto the website, check out the homunculus, and know that this is the stuff that is in our teacher training lessons. When people first come to us, this is what we should be understanding from the get-go. It's absolutely fine if you don't. And remember, in July, I'm doing a whole workshop on communicating with effective cueing based on all of this stuff. So this particular episode is designed to go along with that workshop in July. So I want you to join our newsletter today so that you are the first one to hear about the release of that workshop. I cannot wait for you to join me. Thank you so much. My name's Katie Crane. I am the Pilates professional, and this is another episode of the Pilates Lounge. Have an amazing week, and I will be back for another episode this time next week, every Wednesday on your favorite podcast channel. Have a great day. Take care.